there's a way to make an entrance.
This is my destiny.
It was now a conspiracy of witches.
As the Apollo program was preparing to land on the moon, some saw it as the beginning of a glorious age of exploration, while others were seeing it as the end of an expensive drain on the American budget. Early on July the 16th, 1969, vast numbers were gathering along the beaches of central Florida to witness history. The American people had been preparing for this moment for almost a decade since the late President Kennedy had responded to the Soviet Union's early superiority in space technology by setting a trip to the moon as a national goal. More than 1 million people were crowding the roads and causeways around Cape Canaveral that had recently been renamed Cape Kennedy. Minor dignitaries and friends and families of space workers had access to special stands constructed in the grounds of the Kennedy Space Center to see the Apollo 11 astronauts blast off. While the public had great faith in NASA's ability to land men on the moon, the experts working in the space business put their chances of success at no better than 50-50. The astronauts had spent long hours in simulators preparing for every eventuality, yet the equipment they used for practice only provided an approximation of conditions in space, with some of the test rigs appearing bizarre. A special gantry built at NASA Langley provided something approaching the experience of lunar gravity. Hours before the scheduled launch, the giant Saturn V was slowly taking fuel. Its tanks would be constantly topped up till seconds before liftoff. Michael Collins was the command module pilot. He'd flown previously on Gemini 10. Buzz Aldrin was the lunar module pilot. He'd pioneered new techniques for spacewalking on Gemini 12. And the mission commander was Neil Armstrong. On Gemini 8, his cool head and quick thinking had saved the mission from tragedy. Apollo 11 would have a fully experienced team chosen to deal with and solve difficult problems. And there would be problems. Every NASA mission had built on the experience of previous missions, but there was always a point when they entered unknown territory, and the pressure to reach the moon before the end of 1969 had been unrelenting. We're going to the moon together. But American people were supremely confident, and launch parties were held across the country. Local entrepreneurs were quick to capitalise on the mood of celebration.
Goodbye, mother. So long, mother. So long, mother.
The swing arm now coming back as our countdown continues.
At the Kennedy Launch Center, tension was high. The German-born rocket pioneer, Wernher von Braun, his whole life had been leading up to this moment.
Below we have a team of technicians working.
Everyone at the Cape understood how many different components had to work correctly for a successful launch. Astronauts agreed that the launch made them most anxious.
Firing command coming in now.
This would be the 6th launch of the Saturn V booster, and while some of these flights had been a little lumpy, all were regarded as successful.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 6.
Just seconds into the flight, control was transferred from the firing room in the launch complex to mission control in Houston.
Apollo 11, this is Houston, radio check over.
12 minutes after launch, Apollo 11 was in low Earth orbit. Apart from a slightly rough ride with the third stage, everything had been routine.
5x2, very weak. Can you give us a status report, please?
Trans-lunar injection and docking with the lunar module were now practices that had been done many times before, and they too were achieved with little fuss.
Oh, loud and clear now, Mike, and we understand that you are docked.
The cruise to the moon and lunar orbit had been done twice before, and flight manuals and checklists had all been rewritten with the benefit of previous experience. The Apollo system had been designed so that all the navigation information and engine burns could be made autonomously by the crew. But radio ranging techniques had improved so rapidly that mission control was now giving all instructions. However, the crew still used the onboard technology to determine their position in case of a communications problem. Command module pilots took pride in the accuracy of their navigation. Both the command and lunar modules were equipped with the Apollo guidance computer, one of the first practical microcomputers.
We recommend you accept the nav 49, continue through your sequence of sightings, and then we'll...
For most computations, there was a manual workaround, but for the complex flight path required for the lunar module to land on the moon, the flight computer was essential.
The trunnion angle 47, something to be a little high. Stand by.
Now in lunar orbit, the crew of Apollo 11 would lose radio contact every time they passed behind the moon.
44 over. Yeah, roger.
During the 13th orbit, the lunar module separated from the command module.
How does it look? The Eagle has wings. Right.
The two craft now adopted individual call signs. The command module became Columbia, and the lunar module was now Eagle. Descent to the moon happened in 3 separate stages, each controlled by its own computer program.
Roger, let us know when you're ready to copy. We have a DOI pad.
The first stage was the braking phase that changed the orbit so it would reach a zone above the designated landing point. During this period, the crew were travelling feet first, looking up at the Earth. The next stage was the approach phase, when the Eagle tipped up into a more vertical attitude. This was when Aldrin and Armstrong got their first view of the landing point. A long elliptical region in the Sea of Tranquility was their target. The open plain was judged to be the easiest place for the first lunar landing.
Altitude lights out.
Now, unexpected things began happening. Fuel in the lunar lander's tanks began sloshing around. While this was not dangerous, the motion meant the craft could give no clear indication about its pre-programmed landing site.
Program alarm. The 1202. 1202. Give us a reading on the 1202 program alarm.
Then the flight computer began sounding an alarm, and there was only one person in mission control that knew what a 1202 alarm was. A young software engineer understood the computer was overloaded, but that it could still look after critical functions.
Roger, Delta H is looking good to us.
The mission would continue.
Roger, we got you. We're going at alarm.
The final part of the landing sequence was still computer controlled, but it allowed the commander to override the craft's rate of descent and its positioning. As it was heading for a field of large boulders, Armstrong took control, looking for an appropriate landing area.
100 feet, 3.5 down, 9 forward.
This took a lot longer than anyone expected.
185. Okay, 75 feet. Car's looking good, down a half. 6 forward.
Fuel was running low.
60 seconds. Lights on. 6. Down 2.5. Forward. Forward. That's 40 feet, down 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Straight shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward, drifting to the right a little. 20, down a half. 30 seconds. Forward, just. Good. Okay. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. ACA at a descent. Mode control both auto, descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. 413 is in.
The relief in mission control was palpable.
We copy you down, Eagle. Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Because of the distractions during the descent, no one had a clear idea of the Eagle's exact location.
Master arm on. Take care of the descent.
After the craft was made secure, the flight plan called for the astronauts to get some sleep. But Armstrong and Aldrin requested a change, which was agreed to. They began preparing for their walk on the lunar surface. Around 7 hours later, Armstrong was climbing down the ladder.
Depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches.
A black and white TV camera was now activated, and around the world, 600 million people were watching.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
This was something new. No one had thought that history would be televised with the world as witness.
Mike really is.
It had even been argued that television was a waste of time. Now NASA was rescheduling future missions so their astronauts would step onto the moon in prime time.
You do have to be.
Armstrong and Aldrin spent 2.5 hours on the lunar surface, and much of that time was used in ceremonial duties such as planting the US flag and chatting to the president. The trip back to lunar orbit went smoothly. From here, the 3 astronauts were back on thoroughly understood ground. The 3-day return cruise to Earth was a calm period before a storm of publicity obligations that the Apollo 11 astronauts had not prepared for. Armstrong, Aldrin and Collins were feted in ticker-tape parades across the United States and then across the world. The generous taxpayer funding that had kept the space program going was now in doubt, and NASA was keen to build on this wave of popularity. But in the corridors of power, questions were being asked about the vast sums required to put men on the moon. With the last landing of the shuttle fleet in 2011, the United States, a major contributor to the International Space Station, was reliant upon Russia to ferry astronauts to and from the orbiting laboratory.
3, 2, 1, 0.
But to get cargo and supplies to the ISS, NASA signed contracts with private space technology company SpaceX. SpaceX's cargo capsule, known as Dragon, has regularly been delivering hardware and consumables to orbit since 2012. Dragon can also return from orbit. It's a stepping stone to the company's Dragon version 2 crew capsule that will be able to take astronauts to and from space. Due to make its first manned flight in 2 years, the Dragon takes advantage of new materials and technologies to cut the cost of spaceflight. Its return through the atmosphere will make use of an ablative heat shield, and the current generation of Dragons return via conventional parachute technology. But the new capsule will use propulsive deceleration technology to make a pinpoint landing, enabling it to be reused. The Falcon 9 launcher's 2 stages will also return to the ground for reuse. A Grasshopper technology demonstrator made its first flight in 2012. SpaceX conducted a series of experimental launch and return flights at its test site in McGregor, Texas. The vehicle made 8 successful flights to refine the autonomous return technique. The technology has been incorporated in the Falcon 9. After launching a cargo craft, the booster's first stage attempts to return to an ocean platform. SpaceX technicians are aware that further refinements are needed. In 2006, the European Space Agency began work on a unique star mapper that became known as Gaia. Designed to orbit the Sun at a point 1.5 million kilometres beyond Earth, it will rotate, scanning our local galaxy to accurately gather positional information about the neighbouring stars. 2 different telescopes feed images to the probe's very large, high-definition camera. Over its 5-year operational period, Gaia will rescan the same areas 70 times. As it orbits the Sun, its positional change will enable it to observe parallax differences from which accurate star distances can be determined. In addition to position and distance information, Gaia will collect 2 different types of spectral data. One will help determine the stellar object's speed, and the other will indicate the object's chemical makeup. Gaia was successfully launched at the end of 2013 and has been functioning correctly since. Its pointing and positioning are achieved by cold nitrogen thrusters that do not compromise the satellite's thermal integrity. Gaia's data link with Earth can handle 3 megabits per second, and it will be fed back to ESA's most sensitive ground stations at Cebreros, Spain, and New Norcia in Western Australia.